Chapter 1. The Auction Block. Halcyon Prime was infamous across the galaxy, not for its technology or commerce, but for the shadows cast by its dark dealings. Underneath the bustling surface of trade and intergalactic politics, there lay the sprawling slave market, a festering wound of cruelty hidden in plain sight. Zane Ryder stood quietly amidst the chaos, his hands in his pockets, the hood of his weathered cloak pulled low over his face. A human here, in the depths of Halcyon Prime Slaver's Bazaar, was unusual enough to garner curious glances, but Zane didn't care. He had come with a purpose. Around him, buyers from across the galaxy jostled for space. Tall reptilian Vex, multi-limbed Cyrians, and insectoid Dirian nobles raised their auction paddles, their expressions a mix of hunger and calculation. Each was searching for a different kind of prize warriors, laborers, entertainers, and worse. Zane had seen it all before, the galaxy's dark underbelly that operated under the veneer of civilization. He'd once been a soldier, a part of a system that prided itself on order, but now he was nothing more than a man trying to carve out his own place in the universe. But today, something was different. He had no intention of adding to the misery of those trapped on the auction block. He wasn't here to exploit the weak. He was here to save at least one life. And though he'd never been a man of lofty ideals, the weight of the broken galaxy seemed to press on his shoulders as he watched the proceedings. The auctioneer's voice rang out, cutting through the noise. Next up, a rare find, direct from the core world's Kalari. The crowd stirred, whispers spreading like wildfire. Kalari were not often seen in places like this. They hailed from the mysterious planet of Klin, a society that was advanced, proud, and isolationist. They valued intellect above all else, and had remained aloof from most intergalactic affairs. Zane had heard stories of them beautiful, intelligent, and fiercely independent. As the crowd shifted in anticipation, Zane felt his heart rate quicken. He'd been told about the Kalari being sold today, but seeing her in the flesh was something entirely different. When she stepped onto the platform, the air seemed to still for a moment. She was taller than most humanoids, her skin a deep emerald green that shimmered in the harsh lights. Her long, silken black hair cascaded down her back, accentuating her striking features: high cheekbones, full lips, and eyes that gleamed with a mix of intelligence and quiet fury. She wore a simple, tattered dress that couldn't hide the grace in her movements or the strength in her posture. A thick, metallic collar, engraved with strange symbols, marked her as property, an insult to her very being. Zane's breath caught in his throat. He'd seen many slaves sold in these markets, but there was something about her that made his resolve harden. Her eyes, dark and defiant, scanned the crowd as if daring anyone to come near. Despite her captivity, there was no submission in her gaze, only burning intensity. "She's beautiful," murmured a voice beside him. Zane barely acknowledged the comment, too focused on the auctioneer's spiel. "The finest Kalari specimen we've had in years. Strong, intelligent, and resistant to most forms of illness. Perfect for any need you may have, whether it be labor, companionship, or otherwise." The sleazy implication made Zane's jaw clench. The bidding began, fast and furious. The Kalari's value was apparent, and the buyers were willing to pay for such a rare prize. Paddles shot into the air, and the price climbed higher with each second. Zane's hand tightened around the small device hidden in his cloak. He had a budget, one that stretched his resources thin, but he couldn't walk away now. Something about this woman, this Kalari, made him feel like he had to act. As the bidding reached a fever pitch, a sense of urgency flooded Zane's chest. He raised his hand. 30,000 credits, he said, his voice low but firm. The auctioneer's eyes gleamed with greed. 30,000. Do I hear 35? A Dirian noble hissed nearby, his mandibles clicking in frustration as he raised his bid to 35,000. Others followed suit, but Zane remained resolute. His eyes never left the Kalari. Her gaze was on him now, and for a moment, they locked eyes. She didn't show fear, but there was a flash of something else: surprise, perhaps, or curiosity. Zane couldn't be sure. 40,000, Zane called, louder this time. It was his limit, and he knew it. Beyond that, he'd be risking everything. The crowd murmured, sensing the tension. The Dirian hesitated, and for a brief moment, Zane thought he'd lost. But then the alien clicked his mandibles and turned away, disgust evident in his posture. 40,000 credits, the auctioneer barked, his voice sharp. Going once, going twice. Zane held his breath. Sold. To the human in the cloak. There was a collective sigh of disappointment from the other bidders, but Zane didn't care. The Kalari woman was his, for better or worse. The guards led her off the platform, her hands still bound in glowing restraints. As she approached, Zane pulled back his hood, revealing his human features more clearly. Her eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing. You're coming with me, Zane said quietly. He tried to sound authoritative, but there was a gentleness in his tone, a reassurance that this wasn't what it seemed. The Kalari stared at him for a long moment before speaking, her voice soft but full of defiance. I have no choice, do I? Zane shook his head. For now, no. But that's going to change. She studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing. I don't believe you. You don't have to, Zane replied, his voice steady. Not yet. And with that, he led her away from the auction block, through the winding streets of Halcyon Prime, and toward the starship that would take them far from this wretched place. But as they walked, Zane couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far more complicated than he had anticipated. Chapter 2. The Unspoken Bond. The starship, Mistral, hummed with life as Zane and the Kalari woman boarded. Zane had always preferred solitude, and his ship reflected that choice. There was no crew on board, only the automated systems he had modified and upgraded himself over the years. The interior was sleek but modest, designed for efficiency rather than luxury. The ship's AI greeted him with a calm, professional tone. Welcome aboard, Captain Ryder. All systems are operational. Shall I prepare for immediate departure? Zane glanced over at the Kalari woman, who stood quietly at the entrance of the ship's main deck. Her presence had already begun to alter the familiar, comfortable atmosphere of the Mistral. Yes, he said, his voice slightly tense. Set course for Alire V. We need to get off this rock. The Kalari woman, Alire, looked around the interior of the ship, her hands still bound in glowing restraints. Zane couldn't help but notice her subtle movements, the way her fingers flexed and her muscles tensed beneath the fabric of her worn dress, as if she were constantly preparing to defend herself. Even bound, she radiated strength, and Zane realized that freeing her might be a more complex task than simply unlocking her cuffs. For now, though, they had to focus on leaving Halcyon Prime behind. Zane gestured toward one of the cushioned seats in the main cabin. You should sit. We'll be jumping to hyperspace soon, and it can be rough if you're standing. Alire's gaze flickered toward the seat, but she remained still, her eyes locked on Zane with quiet defiance. You speak as if I have a choice in the matter, she said, her voice low and laced with sarcasm. Zane frowned but didn't rise to the bait. He understood why she distrusted him. After everything she had likely endured, why would she believe a word from a human, especially one who had just purchased her in a slave market? He had to earn her trust, and that would take time. I told you before, Zane said, trying to keep his tone even. I'm not like the others. I didn't buy you to own you. Once we're far enough from Halcyon Prime, I'll get those cuffs off, and you'll be free to go. Her eyes narrowed, clearly skeptical. And why should I believe you? You paid a fortune for me, 40,000 credits, if I heard correctly. No one makes that kind of investment without expecting something in return. Zane sighed and ran a hand through his short hair. She wasn't wrong. 40,000 credits was more than he had ever intended to spend. But when he saw her standing on that auction block, her eyes burning with defiance, he knew he couldn't walk away. Something had driven him to act, even if he didn't fully understand it himself. Believe me or don't, Zane said, meeting her gaze. But I didn't want to see you end up in the hands of someone worse. Out here, in the outer systems, people treat slaves like commodities. They're not going to treat you with respect, and I couldn't just leave you there. Alire's expression softened, if only slightly, but she still didn't move toward the seat. And what happens once we reach Alire V? What then? Zane hesitated. Alire V was his home, a distant, barren world on the fringes of civilized space. He had settled there years ago, after his military career ended in disgrace, preferring the isolation to the chaotic worlds that made up most of the galactic core. There was little to offer on Alire V's simple life in a harsh environment, but it was safe, and most importantly, it was far from places like Halcyon Prime. You'll be free to do whatever you want, Zane said. If you want to leave, I'll help you. If you want to stay, you can, but there won't be any obligations. I'm not asking for anything in return. Alire studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face as if trying to decipher his true intentions. Zane remained still under her gaze, not daring to break eye contact. He wanted her to know that he was serious, that she could trust him. But trust was a fragile thing, especially for someone who had likely been betrayed time and again. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Alire moved. She walked slowly to the seat he had gestured to earlier and sat down, her movements graceful despite the restraints that bound her wrists. She kept her back straight, her posture rigid, as if ready to leap to her feet at any moment. But she had made a choice, however tentative it might be. Zane released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "Thank you," he said quietly, turning back to the control panel. He set the ship's coordinates and initiated the jump sequence. The engines roared softly beneath them as the Mistral prepared to enter hyperspace. Alire didn't respond, but he noticed that she had finally relaxed her hands, the tension in her fingers easing as the ship hummed around them. The silence between them stretched on as the ship accelerated toward the jump point, leaving Halcyon Prime and its slave market far behind. Once they were safely in hyperspace, Zane stood and retrieved a small device from a compartment near the control panel. He walked over to where Alire sat, holding the device up for her to see. It was a simple deactivation tool, designed to unlock the type of restraints she wore. "I'm going to take those off now," Zane said softly. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." Alire's eyes flicked from the device to Zane's face, and for the first time since they met, he saw a flicker of something other than defiance in her gaze, something that looked almost like hope. But she didn't speak. Instead, she held out her wrists, the glowing restraints shimmering in the dim light of the cabin. Zane activated the device, and with a quiet click, the restraints released, falling away from her wrists. Alire rubbed her skin where the cuffs had left faint marks, her expression unreadable. She stood slowly, stretching her arms as if testing her newfound freedom. "You're free," Zane said, stepping back to give her space. "Like I promised." Alire remained silent for a moment, staring down at her freed wrists. Then, without warning, she looked up at Zane, her eyes sharp and intense. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this?" Zane met her gaze, feeling the weight of her question settle heavily in the space between them. He had asked himself the same thing more than once since he had first seen her on that auction block. Why had he been so compelled to act? Why had he risked so much to save someone he didn't even know? "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "Maybe it's because I've seen too much of what the galaxy does to people like you. Maybe it's because I've been in chains myself once, and I know what it's like. Or maybe," he hesitated, unsure of how to put his feelings into words. "Maybe I just couldn't stand the thought of you being hurt." Alire blinked, clearly taken aback by his honesty. She studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for any sign of deception. But Zane's expression remained sincere. He wasn't trying to manipulate her, and she could sense that. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer now. "I've been betrayed by many," she said. "By my own people, by others who promised freedom but only gave more chains. How do I know you won't do the same?" "You don't," Zane replied gently. "All I can do is show you through my actions that I mean what I say." Alire considered his words carefully before nodding. "I will stay for now," she said quietly, "but I will not be your prisoner, and I will not be your servant. I will decide what happens next." Zane smiled faintly, relieved that she had chosen to trust him, even if only a little. "Fair enough," he said. "I wouldn't expect anything less." As the ship continued its journey through the vastness of space, the tension between them slowly began to ease. Though the road ahead would not be easy, Zane felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. Alire had been freed, and now, perhaps, they could both find a way forward together, but on her terms. For the first time in a long while, Zane felt like he was doing something right. Chapter 3. Beneath the Surface. The Mistral cruised through hyperspace, its engines humming softly as it made its way toward Alire V. The stars outside the ship streaked past like long, shimmering lines of light. Inside, the tension between Zane and Alire had settled into an uneasy truce. Zane had kept his promise, her restraints were gone, and for now, she was free to move about the ship as she pleased. But trust was still an elusive thing, fragile and difficult to build after everything she had been through. Zane sat at the ship's helm, staring out into the swirling vortex of hyperspace, his thoughts racing. Alire was sitting at the opposite end of the cabin, her back against the wall, arms crossed over her chest. She had spoken very little since the restraints had been removed, her silence heavy with the weight of unspoken questions. Zane could feel her eyes on him, watching, waiting, as if trying to gauge his true motives. He couldn't blame her. In truth, he still wasn't sure why he had gone so far to save her. Maybe it was guilt from his past, a way to atone for the things he had seen and done during his time in the military. Or maybe it was something more instinctual, a need to protect someone who clearly didn't belong in a place like Halcyon Prime. But one thing was certain. He had no intention of keeping her as a slave. As the silence stretched on, Zane finally broke it. "We'll be on Alire V in about 8 hours, he said, keeping his tone light. "It's not much, but it's home. The planet's a bit rough around the edges, but it's safe, and there's plenty of room if you want to stay." Alire didn't respond immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on him, but her expression was unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but firm. "You've told me what you want for me to be free, but you haven't told me what you want for yourself." Zane blinked, caught off guard by the question. "For myself?" he repeated, more to himself than to her. He hadn't really thought about it. After years of living in the fringes of the galaxy, alone and far from the life he once knew, he had become accustomed to the simplicity of just getting by, day after day. "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess I just want to live in peace, away from the politics, the wars, the corruption. That's why I chose Alire V. It's quiet." Alire studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether or not to believe him. "And do you think bringing me into your life will help you find that peace?" Zane met her gaze, unsure of how to answer. "I don't know. Maybe not," he said honestly. "But I couldn't leave you in that place either. I couldn't just walk away and pretend it wasn't happening." She held his gaze for a moment longer before finally looking away, her expression softening just slightly. "You're a strange human, Zane Ryder," she murmured. "Most humans I've encountered are not like you." Zane chuckled softly, leaning back in his seat. "I get that a lot." A small silence followed, less tense than before. Alire finally stood and approached the viewport, staring out into the vastness of space. Her tall, graceful form seemed almost ethereal in the dim light of the ship's cabin. Zane watched her in quiet contemplation, wondering what was going through her mind. "Kalari value freedom above all else," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Our people are known for their independence, for their intellect. To be captured, to be sold like property. It is the ultimate humiliation. I thought I would rather die than live as someone's slave." Zane felt a pang of sympathy as she spoke. Her words were filled with pain, but there was also a fierce determination beneath them, a refusal to be broken, no matter how dire her situation had been. "I understand," Zane said quietly. "I don't know what you've been through, but I understand the need to be free. That's why I'm giving you a choice. You're not my prisoner." Alire turned to face him, her dark eyes locking onto his. "And what if I choose to leave?" Zane didn't hesitate. "Then I'll take you wherever you want to go," he said simply. "No strings attached." She studied him carefully, as if searching for any sign of deception in his words. But Zane's expression remained open and sincere. He meant what he said, and she could sense that. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded. "Perhaps I will stay," she said quietly. "For now." Zane nodded, relieved but trying not to show it too openly. "That's all I can ask." The rest of the journey passed in relative silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It was no longer filled with distrust or tension, but rather a quiet understanding that something had shifted between them. The wall that had been between them since the auction block was still there, but it had begun to crack, just a little. As the ship neared Alire V, Zane felt a strange sense of anticipation building in his chest. He had lived alone on the planet for so long that the thought of sharing it with someone, especially someone as complicated and mysterious as Alire, was both exciting and daunting. But he also knew that whatever happened next, it would be on her terms. The descent to Alire V was smooth, the ship gliding through the thin atmosphere of the barren planet. Alire V was a far cry from the bustling hub worlds of the galaxy. Its landscape was harsh and unforgiving, with rocky mountains and vast deserts stretching as far as the eye could see. But it had its own kind of beauty, a stark, rugged beauty that Zane had come to appreciate over the years. As the Mistral touched down on a landing pad near his homestead, Zane turned to Alire, who was standing by the viewport, her gaze fixed on the rugged terrain below. "Welcome to Alire V," he said with a faint smile. "It's not much, but it's home." Alire didn't respond immediately. She seemed lost in thought, her expression unreadable as she stared out at the desolate landscape. Finally, she turned to face him, her dark eyes meeting his. "Why did you leave the core worlds?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. "You don't seem like someone who belongs out here in the fringes." Zane hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much to reveal. His past was complicated, and not something he often talked about. But Alire had shared a piece of herself with him, and it seemed only fair to offer something in return. "I used to be in the military," he said quietly, "back when I still believed in the system. But after a while, I saw too much corruption, too much death. I couldn't be a part of it anymore, so I left. Came out here to get away from it all." Alire nodded slowly, as if she understood. "War changes people," she said softly. "It makes us question everything we once believed in." Zane looked at her, surprised by the insight in her words. "Did you fight in any wars?" he asked, curious about her past. Alire's expression darkened slightly, her gaze distant. "Not in the way you would think," she said quietly. "But my people have fought many battles. And I was part of something I never wanted to be." Zane sensed that there was more to her story, but he didn't push. Whatever she had been through, it was clearly painful, and he respected her need for privacy. Instead, he nodded and gestured toward the exit ramp of the ship. "Come on," he said with a faint smile. "Let me show you around. I think you'll like it here." Alire hesitated for a moment, then nodded and followed him down the ramp, stepping onto the dusty surface of Alire V. The wind whipped around them, carrying the faint scent of dry earth and metal. The homestead was simple, a small, sturdy structure nestled against the rocky cliffs, with solar panels and wind turbines providing power. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Zane. As they walked, Alire's gaze swept over the barren landscape, her expression thoughtful. "It's quiet here," she said softly. Zane nodded. "That's why I like it. No one to bother you, no one to tell you what to do. You can just be." Alire looked at him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Perhaps I will stay," she said quietly. "For now." Zane smiled, feeling a strange sense of contentment settle over him. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't alone. But as they stood together on the dusty plains of Alire V, Zane couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was only just beginning. There was still so much he didn't know about Alire, about her past, her people, and the unspoken pain that lingered in her eyes. And though he had promised her freedom, he knew that the bond between them was growing stronger with each passing moment. Chapter 4. Hidden Feelings. Days passed on Alire V, and the desolate planet slowly began to take on a rhythm of its own. Zane and Alire fell into an unspoken routine, coexisting in the quiet, barren landscape that surrounded the homestead. Zane had lived in solitude for so long that having another presence in his life, especially one as enigmatic and guarded as Alire, was both a strange adjustment and a quiet comfort. He hadn't expected her to stay beyond a few days, but to his surprise, she hadn't mentioned leaving again. In the mornings, Zane would check the perimeter of his land, make repairs to the solar panels, and maintain the equipment that kept his little corner of Alire V running. Alire often watched him from a distance, her dark eyes tracking his movements with silent curiosity. She never asked questions, but Zane could tell she was observing him, studying him, perhaps trying to understand why he had chosen this life of isolation. At night, they would sit around the small fire Zane built outside the homestead. The nights on Alire V were cold and clear, the sky above them an endless stretch of stars. It was during these quiet moments that Zane felt the weight of Alire's presence the most. She rarely spoke about herself or her past, but he could sense there was a storm of emotions brewing beneath her calm exterior feelings she kept carefully hidden, even from herself. One night, as the fire crackled between them, Zane decided to break the silence. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his voice soft but probing. "I don't mean to pry, but you don't have to keep everything bottled up, you know? If there's anything you want to talk about, I'm here." Alire's gaze flickered to him, her expression guarded as always. She was sitting cross-legged on the other side of the fire, the flickering flames casting shadows across her emerald skin. For a moment, she didn't respond, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. Then, she sighed softly and looked away, her voice quiet when she finally spoke. "There are some things that words cannot fix," she said, her tone distant. "Some wounds run too deep." Zane nodded, sensing the weight of her words. "I get that," he said quietly, "but sometimes it helps to get it out, even if it doesn't fix anything." Alire was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the fire. Zane could tell she was struggling with something, her emotions warring beneath the surface. He didn't push her, though. He had learned that Alire would speak when she was ready, and not before. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft and filled with an uncharacteristic vulnerability. "Do you want to know why I was on that auction block?" she asked, her eyes still on the fire. Zane blinked, surprised by the question. He had wondered about it, of course, but he hadn't expected her to offer the information so openly. "Only if you're comfortable telling me," he said gently. Alire looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "It's not a story I enjoy telling," she admitted, "but I suppose you've earned the truth." She took a deep breath before continuing, her voice steady but laced with pain. "I was part of a group of Kalari who believed in something different. We were explorers, scientists, trying to learn about the galaxy outside our own borders. My people are isolationists, as you may know. They believe that interacting with other species weakens us, that it dilutes our culture and our purity. But I never believed that. I wanted to see the universe, to understand it. I thought I could make a difference." Zane listened intently, his heart aching at the sadness in her voice. "But we were betrayed," Alire continued, her tone hardening. "Our leaders didn't approve of our mission. They saw us as a threat to the purity of our people, so they sent agents to stop us. We were captured, one by one, and sold into slavery. I was the last one to be caught, and that's how I ended up on Halcyon Prime." Zane's fists clenched involuntarily as she spoke. He had known the galaxy was a cruel place, but hearing her story made him feel a burning anger toward the people who had done this to her. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "You didn't deserve that." Alire looked at him, her eyes shimmering with a mix of sorrow and defiance. "No one deserves it," she said softly. "But that's the way of the galaxy, isn't it? The strong prey on the weak, and those who dare to stand out are crushed." Zane shook his head, his voice firm. "It doesn't have to be that way. There are good people who fight against that. You're not alone." Alire's gaze softened slightly, and for the first time since they met, Zane saw a flicker of something in her eyes that he hadn't seen before: hope, perhaps, or maybe even gratitude. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced once again by her familiar stoic mask. "You're different," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Most humans I've met are selfish, arrogant. But you risked everything to save me, and you ask for nothing in return. Why?" Zane met her gaze, his expression serious. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply. "I've seen enough cruelty in my life. I didn't want to add to it." Alire studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face for any sign of deception. But Zane's expression remained sincere, and after a moment, she nodded, as if accepting his words. Silence fell between them once more, but this time it was a more comfortable silence. The fire crackled softly, casting warm light over the barren landscape of Alire V. Zane felt a strange sense of peace settle over him, as if for the first time in years, he wasn't alone. After a while, Alire spoke again, her voice softer than before. "I've never met anyone like you," she said quietly. "I've never felt like this before." Zane's heart skipped a beat at her words, and he turned to look at her, surprised by the vulnerability in her voice. Felt like what? He asked gently. Alire hesitated, her gaze dropping to the fire. Safe, she said finally, her voice barely audible. I feel safe with you. Zane's chest tightened at her words, a rush of warmth flooding through him. He had never expected this, never expected to form a bond with someone like Alire, someone who had been through so much. But now, sitting beside her under the stars, he realized that he cared about her deeply. You are safe with me, he said softly, his voice filled with quiet conviction. I won't let anything happen to you. Alire looked up at him, her eyes shining with emotion. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the unspoken connection between them growing stronger with each passing second. And in that moment, Zane realized that something had changed between them, something profound and unshakable. He didn't know what the future held for them, but he knew one thing for certain. He would do anything to protect her. Alire seemed to sense his resolve, and after a long moment, she smiled, a small, hesitant smile, but a smile nonetheless. It was the first time Zane had seen her smile since they met, and it made his heart soar. Thank you, she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet vulnerability. For everything. Zane smiled back, his chest swelling with emotion. You don't have to thank me, he said gently. I'm just glad you're here. Alire's gaze softened, and for the first time since they met, Zane saw a flicker of something deeper in her eyes, something that went beyond gratitude or trust. It was a feeling that neither of them had expected, but one that was undeniable. As they sat together under the vast, star-filled sky, Zane realized that their bond had grown into something far more than either of them had anticipated. It wasn't just about survival or freedom anymore. It was about something deeper, something that neither of them could put into words. And though they had both come from different worlds, different lives, they had found something rare and precious in each other. As the fire crackled softly between them, Zane knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, they had found something worth fighting for. The stars above seemed to shine a little brighter, and in the quiet darkness of Alire V, two hearts, once lost and broken, began to heal.